This guide is for any tank at endgame, primarily people who are either just starting to tank or trying to get their first orange parse. We will mostly be discussing tanking concepts rather than specific skills. With the current state of tanks as of patch 5.2, they all play somewhat the same. Fishing for low blow procs on Dark Knight, keeping track of fell cleave stacks on Warrior, and any kind of tank class identity is a thing of the past now. Though this is probably the most balanced tanks have ever been in FF14, this comes at the cost of them all playing somewhat similarly. So what makes a good tank? High damage, good positioning, helping the healers by mitigating damage efficiently, knowing the mechanics? It should be all of these combined. I've seen a lot of tanks that only worry about damage, but they fail to realize that they are lowering their healer's DPS for the sake of their own, or constantly eating the floor and doing negative damage by wasting somebody's MP on a raise, or just wasting a clear party's time by dying as the main tank and wiping the party. Having full raid awareness as a tank will help with early raid clears and successful clears in general. I've broken down some concepts into 3 sections: general basics, tanking basics, and advanced tanking. These general basics apply to all classes, but will determine how well you do as a tank overall. They are important to understand if you are a new player without much experience with raiding, as they are the base skills of all advanced players. For people new to the game and just starting to tank, here is some important terminology that is commonly used. This is a GCD, or global cooldown. Pretty much any weapon skill or spell will have this spinning animation. And this is a OGCD, or off global cooldown. Pretty much any ability that will let you cast it in between a GCD. Uptime is how well you can constantly use your GCD, meaning this spinning animation cannot stop even for a split second except for when the boss is untargetable. This timeline is what 100% uptime looks like. If your GCD recast is 2.39 seconds, 5 GCDs should be done in 11.95 seconds. Clipping is when you lose some uptime because of using an OGCD in between GCDs too late. This is what clipping looks like here if your GCD gets delayed because of your OGCD not going off. And this is what it should look like without clipping. Your opener is the initial rotation for your class for the start of a fight. It's an important part of your damage, as it's one of the only times where you will have all of your cooldowns and all of your party buffs synced together. Know the fight, and by that I mean knowing what is coming next at all times. Everyone knows what happens when the main tank doesn't know what to do next, dies, and then the boss starts massacring people. Watch raid guides all you want, but they will never fully prepare you for actually learning a raid. Knowing what to do in a fight is muscle memory, so go into a learning party, die at the point where you're confused about, and ask people what to do. It might be useful for some people to have a raid guide to reference off of after they die to see what they did wrong. Most likely, if you're panicking during a mechanic, it's because you didn't anticipate it. Recording yourself and rewatching the place where you die to analyze what to do will also help you learn to fight faster. If you can't record yourself, instead of knowing that you should be at the A marker somewhere after X mechanic, try to understand what the mechanic does and ask yourself, why do I go to A to resolve that mechanic? Understanding the mechanic will allow you to react faster and give you extra time to not fail. You'll also be able to adjust to other people's mistakes and potentially save what might have been a wipe. Get comfortable with your key bindings and skills. If you find yourself panicking because you're looking for a skill on your hotbar, then you're doing something wrong. Get used to your key bindings and where your skills are located so that they are like second nature when using them. This will give you the reaction time needed to respond quickly to cast bars and mechanics. You should only be taking a quick peek at your hotbar when you're checking to see if a skill is off cooldown instead of fully zoning in on your hotbar and staring at a skill countdown for 10 seconds. This is all preference, but I use a MMO mouse to reduce the amount of work my keyboard hand needs to do. It is also faster in my opinion, as almost all of my skills are only one keystroke. Some people I've talked with that don't use an MMO mouse would bind their two side buttons into Control and Shift, so that they have faster access to a 2-key combo to activate their skills. Like I've said, it's pretty much preference and will differ from person to person on how they like to play. Try out some different key bindings and see what you like best. I deliberately keybind heavily used skills onto the easier buttons to reach. This will make it easier to get used to your keybinds faster. Take a look at your skills and see what you use frequently so that you can start binding your easy to reach buttons to them. Rolling your GCDs. Rolling your GCDs should look like this. Your GCD should always be off cooldown, meaning you're doing your combo without missing even 1/10 of a second. Without practicing my previous 2 points, rolling your GCDs might be difficult because you'll be panicking most of the time. Once you're comfortable with your skills and the fight, practice rolling your GCDs for the entire fight. Mastering your opener will give a good indication that you are used to most of your key bindings. Just sit at the training dummy and go at it whenever you're just waiting around with nothing else to do. Go into any raid in Party Finder and just get experience. Weaving. Weaving is just using an OGCD in between GCDs. It helps a lot with rolling your GCDs when you need to use a defensive or to fit OGCDs into a buff window. Tanks can typically weave 2 skills in before it clips their next GCD because of their slow GCD recast. If you're having trouble double weaving, you might want to look into a VPN like Ping Zapper. I have personally used Ping Zapper playing from Japan on the Primal Data Center and had no issues with double weaving. A lot of experienced players will say that it's all about the DPS, but you can't DPS if you're eating the floor all the time. Join a learning party, make mistakes, and learn, because learning parties are for learning. Practicing on a training dummy and in raids in Party Finder will help with both weaving and rolling your GCDs. On top of dodging mechanics and your rotation, tanks have 4 important tasks that they need to handle during a raid. Mastering these tasks won't help out with raising your damage, but you can't raise your damage if you can't clear the fight. Tank Busters. The general basics should help prepare you to handle tank busters 99% of the time. If you're comfortable with your rotation in the fight, you should be able to react to the cast bar of the tank busters fast enough. Or even better, pre-pop your defensive before the boss even casts it. With the current state of tanks, all tanks have a fast cooldown defensive and a set of long cooldown defensives. Usually, 1 long cooldown and 1 fast cooldown defensive should be enough to handle any average tank buster. Don't needlessly overstack defensives because usually you can use them in a more strategic place in the fight. Keep in mind that some tank busters can be somewhat cheesed with your invincibility skill, so don't be afraid to coordinate with your party about using it. You typically want to be looking at the boss's cast bar area when anticipating a tank buster. Once you see the cast bar pop up, you can adjust accordingly depending on where you are in your GCD rotation. Tank swapping. If you need to take aggro, you can typically provoke during the cast of the tank buster. Provoking as fast as possible will let your co-tank shirk you in time, so it is better to anticipate the tank buster to adjust your GCD for weaving a provoke in early. Again, just like for tank busters, you want to watch the boss's cast bar area, and once you see the tank buster pop up, you can decide whether you need to finish this GCD first and then provoke, or just provoke right away. If you need to shirk, watch the boss and look for a provoke animation during its tank buster cast. This is probably the best way to react fast so that you have the time to weave in shirk. And this way you can know for sure if your co-tank is provoking too late in the cast. Positioning. Almost every raid tier has had at least one boss that requires some sort of positioning to make the fight easier. The method to control pulling the boss around is very hard to describe in words, as you just need to get a feel for how to move a monster around. But it's always possible to reposition a boss when necessary. There is usually enough time to move the boss around when it is not casting something. Let's take E8S as an example. You start off by pulling Shiva to the very center, since you need to either drag her north or south during her first mirror mechanic. You don't want to drag her too north or too south because of the chance that she'll be very far away from where you'll eventually need to drag her to. Melee DPS, including the tanks, will want to keep uptime on her for as long as possible, so having to drag her the shortest distance will be ideal. After her mirrors go off, you will want to drag her back to the middle so that every melee DPS won't lose a GCD by chance during her teleport. You can only move a boss by pulling it, not pushing, so imagine tugging on the boss by a leash to move it around. As you can see in this clip, when I reposition Shiva back to the middle, I try to imagine a line that will drag the boss through the center, and I also use the outer ring on the floor to know when to stop. Without this outer ring, you can just keep a small memo in your mind that there's around this amount of distance between the target circle and your character. Having a good marker on the floor as a frame of reference to where the center is might be a good way to help position the boss around. It can be some sort of pattern on the floor or an actual set marker. Lastly, keep in mind of the DPS's positionals when moving the boss around. You want to limit how much the boss spins when moving it. This clip is from a dungeon of what not to do, as I currently don't have a DPS to get a clip of a pug tank in a raid. You should be aware of melee DPS that need positionals to position the boss correctly. Mitigation. Reprisal and AoE defensives might not exist in the future, but I think they will always give the tank some sort of raid-wide mitigation skill. Where to use these skills. Reprisal and your AoE defensive skills should be used primarily on raid-wide AoEs. Typically, you shouldn't stack both your Reprisal and AoE skill, unless it's required to survive or if there's nothing else to use it on. If your party keeps wiping to one part of the raid where there's a heavy raid-wide AoE, fit in a Reprisal or AoE defensive there to see if that changes anything. More often than not, it will usually help with surviving. If you're in a static, coordinate with your co-tank and healers on who reprisals what and where to use your AoE defensive skills. So you've done a raid a handful of times and you think you're ready to achieve orange for that fight. A lot of small details will add up to out-damaging the average player base. Though most of the time it just comes down to crit RNG when you're trying to improve at an already high point. If that's the case, you probably don't need this guide. Analyzing FF logs. FF logs is the best tool for checking where you can improve during a fight. I will briefly go over navigating the timeline and then jump straight into some examples of myself analyzing my own logs. It would take a very long time to go over everything you can do in FF logs, so it might be best to use my examples as a starting point to create your own way of analyzing. This is the timeline here, and we can zoom into a specific time of the fight by click, hold, and dragging to highlight a section. It's good for seeing data within this section of the fight. To reset the zoom, it's over here. Kill time is located here, and this value is pretty important when comparing to another log as you want to compare to a similar kill time. I'll give 3 examples of analyzing FF logs as a tank. I've deliberately chosen my early Shiva clear as it will be easier to point out mistakes I've made. The first one is to improve damage. I've taken this random log to compare with mine. We can see here that we have similar kill times, but this person got off more blood spillers than I did. This makes me think that I should be more aware of keeping track of my blood gauge, since I probably overcapped at some point. The second one is to analyze defensive cooldowns. Here we can see that most defensives look fine except for Dark Mind. So let's add the Dark Mind timeline to compare by clicking on this plus button. Now let's put up my damage taken graph to see when the damage is spicy. Since Dark Mind is magic damage only, we need to be a little more selective when looking at where to place it. It looks like this section is just auto attacks, so Dark Mind is useless here. After the add phase, it looks like Akmorn does some damage to me. So using Dark Mind after add phase on Akmorn seems like it would possibly help, since I'm main tanking there. The third one is analyzing my reprisals. First, let's put our reprisal on the board, and then our co-tanks as well. Then, we will look at the overall damage graph. It looks like here that our co-tank takes care of Light Rampart. Which leaves us with this section. This is where Shiva casts 2 Path of Light during the orbs, and it looks like we can reprisal the second Path of Light since it seems to do more damage there. These are just some examples of how I use FFlogs to improve myself as a tank. I would suggest setting aside some time to play around with the features FFlogs has to offer to see what other useful information you can gather from it. Gap closing. Sometimes you're far away from the boss waiting for it to finish an AoE to run back in. For AoEs with cast bars, you are safe right after the cast, but for ones without a cast bar, you'll need to make a judgment on how long to wait until you can run back in. For me, I will watch the boss for a certain point in its animation and count down so I can mark how long I need to wait in order to move back in. Positioning continued. When positioning or repositioning the boss, you can do it without losing your own uptime. When you know your GCD will come up, hit the boss, and then pull it away and repeat until it's at its position, like in this clip. Mitigation continued. Don't use defensives only on tank busters. I consider this a bit advanced because as painful as it sounds, a raid by design is doable without using defensives for boss auto attacks. So it's really just HP padding and extra DPS for healers. You can plan out defensives for auto attacks or AoEs either with an Excel sheet or FFlogs. The concept is to map down the tank busters and when the boss becomes untargetable, and then plan out your defensives. I personally use FFlogs for timestamps and Excel to map out my defensives. Food and potion. Using pots on top of food is probably one of the biggest differentiators in damage among tanks. Not everyone is a super crafter or have loads of money, but I do recommend maxing alchemy, cooking, and all the gatherers on your spare time. It might be a slow process, but these classes are all you need to be self-sufficient in raid supplies. Increasing damage. Lastly, to increase your damage, I have 2 tips to give. First, you will want to master the general basics. Having high uptime by optimizing rolling your GCDs for maximum cast, weaving properly, and using food and pots should already get you into purple to orange range. Second is to look out for buffs after the opener and unload most of your skills in the buff window. For example, for Dark Knights who have a ninja in their party, their Carven Spit will share cooldown with Trick Attack. So you will always want to put Carven Spit into the Trick Attack window every time it comes off of cooldown. You can look out for Trick Attack on the boss's debuffs or have ACT call it out for you. Practice makes perfect, so practicing every point in this guide should carry over into any patch or raid tier. With these tanking points in mind, whether it's a learning or clear party, go into Party Finder and practice.